I remember the sound the river made the night I let her die. Not a scream. Rivers don't scream. It was a long, low swallow. The sound of black water folding over something and closing up again like it had never been disturbed at all. I stood on the bank with my shoes still dry, and I told myself the current was too fast. The night was too cold. That a grown man, freezing to death, trying to save a stranger's wife was no kind of help to anyone. I told myself a lot of things that night. All of them were excuses. All of them were true, and none of them were forgivable. Her name was Yuki. I didn't even know that then. I learned it 3 days later at the little shrine where the village burned paper money for her, from an old woman who kept saying she had no one left. No one at all. And still, no one went in after her. I stood at the back of that crowd with my hands in my pockets, and I felt something in my chest fold shut, the same way the river had folded over her, and it never opened again. Not in 40 more years of ordinary living, ordinary regret, ordinary silence. I want you to understand that I didn't spend those 40 years drowning in guilt in any dramatic way. That would almost have been easier. A clean, visible wound is at least honest about what it is. Mine was quieter than that. I married eventually a woman who deserved better patience than I gave her. I raised 2 children who grew up and moved away to cities I never visited because some part of me had decided on that riverbank that I didn't deserve the ordinary comfort of being followed or missed. I worked. I paid my taxes. I nodded to neighbors. From the outside, I imagine I looked like a perfectly unremarkable old man living out a perfectly unremarkable life. But every single autumn, when the rivers ran high and cold with the first real rains, I would find some excuse to walk down to the water's edge alone, and I would stand there until my feet went numb, as if the cold itself were a kind of penance I owed and kept trying badly to pay off. My wife asked me about it exactly once early in our marriage, and I gave her an answer so evasive she never asked again, which I think, looking back from wherever I'm looking back from now, was its own small cruelty added to the pile. I died old in a narrow bed in a house that had never once felt warm. My last coherent thought, as strange as this is to admit, wasn't about my wife or my children or any of the ordinary things a dying man is supposed to think about. It was about black water folding shut over a stranger and a version of myself standing dry-shod on the bank, doing the arithmetic of his own cowardice one final time before the lights went out entirely. And somewhere in the black, nothing between one life and the next, I made myself a promise so small and so stupid it barely counted as a promise at all. Next time, if there is a next time, I go in, I open my eyes to smoke and hunger. Not metaphorical hunger, the real kind, the kind that lives behind your ribs like a second heartbeat. I was small, filthy, lying on a straw mat in a hut with a roof that leaked starlight through its cracks, and a woman I didn't recognize was pressing a rag to my forehead and murmuring a name that wasn't mine, except now it was. Keita. I want to tell you, the transition was gentle. It wasn't. Whoever built the rules of rebirth in this universe was not a merciful architect. I remember fever dreams stitched together from 2 lives at once, a river in one world, a well in another, the taste of medicine that didn't exist yet layered over the taste of medicine I'd choke down as an old man 40 years from now or 40 years ago. I genuinely couldn't tell you which direction time was supposed to be pointing. What I understood once the fever finally broke and I could sit up without the room tilting was this. I had been given exactly the kind of life I would have designed if someone had asked me, as a joke, what's the worst possible second chance you could get? A poor fishing village, a famine year. Not the ordinary lean season, but the real thing. The kind where the rice stores empty by midwinter and people start looking at each other's chickens with a hunger that isn't about chickens at all. A family that had died of a coughing sickness 2 winters back, leaving behind a boy, Mia, who'd been taken in by an aunt who resented every mouthful I ate and made sure I knew it. My aunt's name was Chio, and I want to be fair to her even now, even knowing what I know about how she treated me, because fairness was one of the few things I'd promised myself I would carry properly into this second life. She was not a cruel woman by nature. She was a frightened one, widowed early herself, raising 2 children of her own blood on a strip of land too thin to properly support them even in a good year, and into that thin, frightened household had been dropped a 3rd child who wasn't hers, who ate rice that could have gone to her own son, who represented every single day one more mouth between her family and the edge of that famine. She never struck me. I want that on record too. But she had a way of serving rice that made the arithmetic of the household perfectly clear without a single word needing to be spoken. A slightly smaller bowl, a slightly longer pause before my portion was set down, a habit of calling me the boy rather than by my name in front of guests, as if reminding herself and everyone else that the tie between us was obligation rather than love. I understood her. I understood her with the particular aching clarity of a man who had once been an old grudging relative himself in some other configuration of some other family, 40 years and one entire death away. Understanding didn't make the smaller bowl taste any less like what it was. I was nobody. I was less than nobody. I was a spare mouth in a village that couldn't feed the mouths it already had, in a household that resented feeding me and would never quite say so out loud. And some nights, lying on my mat listening to Chio's own children breathe evenly in their sleep, while my stomach ached with a hunger no one in that house was going to solve for me, I caught myself almost laughing at the shape of the joke the universe had played. Here, a second chance. Try again. And see how you like being the unwanted one this time. And somewhere in that village, I already knew, buried under 2 lifetimes of memory that didn't belong in the same skull, was a widow named Yuki. It took me 4 months to work up the courage to look for her. And when I say courage, understand that I don't mean the good kind. I mean the kind born from lying awake every night doing arithmetic with my own guilt. She drowned trying to cross the river to fetch medicine for a sick neighbor. In this life, has anyone even asked her to make that crossing yet? Is there still time? There was still time. I found her in early autumn, hauling water up from the same river that had killed her in another version of this story, and my whole body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. She was younger here than I remembered her being at that funeral, and of course she was. Everyone ages differently in memory than in life, but it was her, the same tired set to her shoulders, the same way of tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear like she was embarrassed to be seen struggling. I didn't introduce myself. I didn't say anything clever. I just started carrying water buckets alongside her every evening without asking permission, until one day she stopped pretending she hadn't noticed and said flatly, "You're going to keep doing this whether I object or not, aren't you?" "Yes," I said. She almost smiled. Almost. For weeks after that, our arrangement had no name and needed none. I'd finish whatever thin chores Chio's household demanded of me, and then I'd walk the long way to the river, and Yuki would already be there, or would arrive shortly after, and we would fill buckets together in a silence that slowly, without either of us deciding it should, stopped being awkward and started being comfortable. She asked me questions sometimes, the careful sideways kind that widows in small villages learn to ask so as not to invite gossip. Why a boy from a household that already had 2 grown children of its own bothered spending his evenings hauling water for a woman who wasn't his family, whether Chio minded, whether I minded. I like the walk, I told her once, which was true in the smallest, most useless way, and left out the much larger truth underneath it that some ancient, exhausted part of me needed, the way a body needs food to prove to itself, evening after evening, that this time the outcome could be different. That I could be someone who showed up instead of someone who stood dry-shod on a bank doing arithmetic. She never pushed past the small truths I offered her. I think, looking back, she recognized in me some version of her own careful self-containment, a person keeping a private grief tucked somewhere it couldn't be touched by casual questions, and extended me the same courtesy she would have wanted extended to her. We built trust the slow way, the only way that actually holds, bucket by bucket, evening by evening, neither of us asking for more truth than the other was ready to give. The famine got worse before it got better. It always does. That's the cruelty of famines. They don't announce their worst month in advance, so you can brace for it. By the time the first snow came, half the village was surviving on bark tea and thin gruel, and the river, which should have been our salvation, had been half fished out by every desperate hand in 3 villages, competing for the same shrinking catch. That was the night Yuki's neighbor took sick. The same sickness, the same medicine needed from the same herbalist across the same black water, except this time the crossing was worse, the ice already forming in thin, treacherous sheets along the banks, and this time it wasn't a stranger who volunteered to go, it was Yuki. Because of course it was. Some patterns want to repeat themselves whether you interfere or not, like water finding the same groove in stone. I got to the bank before she finished securing the rope to the old ferry post, and for one terrible second, I was 17 years old, in a different body, in a different world, standing dry-shod, on a different bank, watching someone I would spend the rest of my life failing to save. Not this time. I don't remember deciding to move. I remember the cold hitting my chest like a wall, the current trying to peel my grip off the rope, the taste of river water, and old fear in the back of my throat. I remember getting an arm around her, dragging both of us toward the shallows on nothing but stubbornness and 40 years of borrowed regret. I remember lying on the bank afterward, both of us, coughing up water, both of us alive, and thinking, with a clarity that felt like the first true thought I'd had in 2 lifetimes. There, that's done, that debt is paid. I didn't know yet that the universe had been keeping a ledger of its own. She came to my aunt's hut 3 days later, once the fever from the cold had passed, and she didn't say thank you. Thank you would have been too small a word for whatever had actually happened between us on that riverbank, and I think we both knew it. Instead, she pressed something into my palm, closed my fingers over it, and said, "My husband's mother gave me this before she died. She said it was old. Older than the village," she said. A pause, like she was deciding whether the next part was foolish to say out loud. She said it opens for the right person, and that I'd know the right person when I saw them try to drown themselves saving somebody. It was a ring, plain silver, tarnished, nearly black, with a single stone set into it that caught the weak winter light strangely. Not like glass, not like any gem I recognized, but like something with a pupil. A fish's eye. If a fish's eye could hold that much color at once. "I can't take this," I said, "because that's what you say. You already have," she said, and closed my fingers tighter around it and left before I could argue further, which I understood even then was its own kind of answer. I carried that ring around in my pocket for 3 full days before I found the nerve to look at it properly, and I want to be honest about why. Some old superstitious part of me, the part that had spent 40 years walking down to rivers every autumn to pay a debt with cold feet, was afraid that examining it too closely would somehow undo whatever grace had let me save her this time. As if good fortune were a held breath that too much attention might knock loose. I didn't understand what I was holding until that night, alone, with the hut quiet and my aunt asleep and the cold pressing in through every gap in the walls. I turned the ring over in my fingers by the light of a single dying coal, and the stone, the fish eye stone, caught that light and didn't let it go. It held it. It grew brighter instead of dimmer, brighter, until the whole hut washed out in a color I have never had a word for in either of my lives, somewhere between the green of new rice and the gold of a coin. And I felt it, not heard it, felt it, the way you feel a held breath before you know why, a door opening somewhere that had never had a door before. I did not decide to reach toward that opening. My hand simply understood something my mind hadn't caught up to yet, and I pushed through a threshold that wasn't there a heartbeat earlier, and the freezing famine winter hut disappeared behind me like a page turning. What replaced it was warmth, real warmth, soaking up through the soles of my bare feet from soil that had no business being warm in the dead of winter. Water that didn't look cold, didn't move like cold water moves, spread out in a long pond, fringed with reeds that were somehow, impossibly, still green. And beneath that water, I could see it even before my eyes adjusted, even before I understood what I was looking at. Fish, dozens of them, more than dozens. Silver bodies turning slow, lazy circles in water that glowed faintly from somewhere beneath, in a place that should not exist, behind a door that should not have opened. In a life I had been given, I now understood for reasons far larger than one drowned widow and one late apology. I stood at the edge of that pond in the depths of a famine winter with fish enough beneath my feet to feed a village. And for the first time since I'd opened my eyes in this new life, I laughed. One short, disbelieving bark of a sound that echoed strangely off-water that shouldn't glow, in an air that shouldn't be warm, in a world hidden inside a dead woman's ring. Then, because I had spent one whole lifetime learning what happens to people who get too greedy too fast in front of witnesses, I did the only sensible thing. I caught exactly 2 fish, tied them to a length of cord, stepped back through the door into the freezing hut, and let the ring go dark and cold and ordinary in my palm, just an old bit of tarnished silver. The kind of thing a poor fisherman's boy might have found washed up on a riverbank, nothing anyone would look at twice. 2 carp. A poor boy's lucky catch in the worst winter anyone could remember. Nobody would ever believe what was actually sitting behind that stone. That, I already understood, was going to be the whole of my problem from here on out. Chapter 2. 2 carp on a stringer. 3 villages in secret. I didn't sleep at all that first night. I sat by the coals, turning the ring over and over, waiting for the light to come back, half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing out of hunger and cold and 40 years of regret finally catching up with a starving 14-year-old's brain. It came back. Of course it came back. Toward dawn, when the coal had gone to ash and the hut was at its coldest, the stone caught what little light there was and swelled with that same impossible color, and the door opened again, patient as ever, like it had never once doubted I'd return. I want to describe that pond properly because I spent the better part of the following week doing nothing but walking its edges, cataloging it the way you'd catalog a fortune you were terrified to touch too roughly in case it turned out to be a dream. It was long, longer than any pond had a right to be, curling out of sight around a bend of reeds that didn't seem to lead anywhere, as though the space itself hadn't decided yet how large it wanted to be. The soil at its banks was black and rich and warm to the touch, even when I knew, when I stepped back through the door, that outside it was cold enough to crack water pipes. The water itself had a faint sweetness to it when I cupped my hands and drank, and the first time I did that, a blister I'd been nursing on my heel for 2 weeks, the ordinary kind, from ill-fitting sandals, was simply gone by the time I'd walked the length of the bank and back. And the fish, that was the part that frightened me most, in the specific way that impossible good fortune frightens a person who has learned the hard way that nothing comes free. I marked a shallow inlet on my second visit, scratched a rough line into the mud with a stick, roughly where the school of silver carp had been clustered, and when I came back the next night, there were more fish inside that line than there had been before. Not a great many more, but more, in a single day, in water that was neither warm enough for that kind of breeding nor connected to any river I could find, no matter how far I followed its bends. I didn't understand the rule yet. I only understood that there was one, and that whatever this place was, it wasn't simply a treasure to be emptied. It was alive. It was growing. And it seemed, in whatever strange logic governed it, to be growing in proportion to something, though it would be weeks before I worked out that the something was me, what I risked, what I gave away, what I chose to protect instead of hoard. I ran small, careful experiments that first week, the way I imagine any reasonably cautious person would, handed an impossible gift and no instruction manual for it. I tried taking a large haul once, not to keep, I told myself, only to test the limit, and hauled out perhaps 30 fish in a single visit, more than any sane fisherman's boy could plausibly explain away. The pond didn't punish me for it, not directly, but when I returned 2 days later, the school in that stretch of water was visibly thinner, slower to replenish than it had been after my smaller, more modest takings, and the warm soil at that particular bank felt, underfoot, faintly less warm than it did elsewhere. It recovered eventually, but the lesson landed all the same. This was not a bottomless well to be drained on a whim. It had a rhythm, a tolerance, a way of noticing excess and answering it with scarcity. I tried on a different night, simply sitting at the water's edge and doing nothing at all, taking no fish, drinking none of the water, just existing quietly in that warm, glowing space for the better part of an hour, out of nothing more than curiosity about whether presence alone changed anything. It didn't, as far as I could tell. The pond seemed entirely indifferent to my simply being there. It responded, I would come to understand over the following months, only to what I chose to do with what it gave me once I stepped back through the door, whether I hoarded a gift or spent it on somebody else's survival. Sitting idle taught it nothing about me at all. I tried, once, dropping a coin into the water, an old, worn piece I'd found on the road, testing whether the pond responded to ordinary offerings the way certain shrines were said to. Nothing happened. The coin simply sat on the pale, sandy bottom, exactly as ordinary and inert as it had been in my pocket, and I understood, a little sheepishly, that whatever intelligence sat behind this place, It wasn't interested in tribute. It was interested, apparently, in character, though it would take the whole hard winter ahead for me to fully believe that, let alone trust it. I made myself a set of rules that first week, sitting cross-legged on the warm black soil with cold famine winter reality, waiting on the other side of a door I could open and close at will. Take little, take rarely, never take so much that a starving village would ask where a starving boy found it. Never let anyone see the door open. Never, under any circumstance, let anyone follow. I broke none of those rules for a long time. I want that on record because everything that came after, the growing trust, the growing risk, the growing warmth of people I had no right to expect warmth from in a life I'd been given as a kind of penance, all of it started from a boy standing very still at the edge of a pond that shouldn't exist, refusing to be greedy with a miracle. Two carp became my whole personality that winter. I brought them home tied to a bit of cord, told my aunt I'd found a lucky bend in the ice-choked river, and endured her suspicious glare with the same flat patience I'd endured everything else from her. She didn't believe me. She also didn't refuse the fish, which told me everything I needed to know about where her priorities sat, and honestly, in a famine winter, I couldn't blame her for it. But two carp, twice a week, wasn't going to feed a village, and feeding the village, not becoming rich, not becoming powerful, just making sure the people around me didn't die the way an entire family somewhere in this world had already died once, in a version of history only I remembered. That had become, without my quite noticing when it happened, the actual point of the whole strange gift I'd been handed. I needed a way to move more fish than one boy could plausibly catch without anyone asking the plain and dangerous question, where is all this coming from? That's where Mitsu came in. She ran the smokehouse at the edge of the second village over, not my village, which mattered because it meant fewer eyes that knew my face well enough to notice a pattern. She was younger than I expected a smokehouse owner to be, sharp-eyed in the particular way of someone who'd inherited a business from a father who died owing money and had spent every day since making sure she never owed anyone anything again. I'd heard of her from an old fisherman who complained with real bitterness that she paid fair prices, and that was exactly the problem because fair prices meant everyone wanted to sell to her and nobody wanted to sell to him. Fair prices. That was all I needed to hear. I went to her with a stringer of 6 fish, 6 not 2, my first real test of the rules I'd set myself, and told her I'd had a good week on a stretch of river most fishermen avoided because the current was bad there. It was a small lie sitting on top of a much larger one, and I watched her weigh both me and the fish with the same careful assessing look. 6 fish in this winter from a stretch of river everyone else has already picked clean, she said. Not a question. A test of her own. I know a bad current when I see one, I said. Most people don't want the risk. I don't mind it. She looked at me a moment longer. A boy, thin with hunger like every other boy in the region that winter, offering fish that were, if she looked closely, a little too healthy, a little too silver, a little too clearly not starved, half to death the way every other catch that season had been. I saw the question form behind her eyes. I also saw her decide with the particular pragmatism of someone who has learned not to look too hard at good luck during a famine, not to ask it. Bring me what you catch, she said instead. I'll take it on consignment. You get paid when it sells, not before. That's the arrangement, or there's no arrangement. That's fair, I said and meant it. She studied me a moment longer before I turned to go, and there was something in her expression that wasn't quite suspicion and wasn't quite kindness either, the particular look of a person who has learned to survive by reading others quickly and accurately, deciding case by case who was worth extending trust to before that trust had been earned. You're not from this village, she said. It wasn't a question. I'd have remembered a boy this careful about his prices. No, I said, other side of the river. Good, she said, with a small, dry twist of humor I hadn't expected from someone who'd inherited a business from a father who died owing money. That means whatever trouble you're not telling me about, it's not going to walk in through my front door looking for you. I like that kind of arrangement. Keeps my hands clean. I liked her immediately, in the specific way you like someone who has decided, unprompted, to be honest with you about the exact shape of the boundaries they're drawing. It made the lie I was carrying feel a little less like betrayal and a little more like a private matter neither of us was obligated to share with the other. Business, not friendship. Not yet, though that would change, slowly, the way most things in that winter changed slowly, one honest transaction at a time. That was the beginning of the only kind of wealth I actually wanted that winter. Not gold, but a ways to turn an impossible pond into rice for people who would otherwise have gone without it, one modest, plausible stringer of fish at a time. I kept the number small on purpose. 6 fish became 8, became a dozen, spread carefully across 2 villages so that no single smokehouse, no single family, no single suspicious neighbor ever saw enough at once to do the arithmetic and land on the word impossible. I varied which stretch of river I claimed to fish. I let myself be seen failing sometimes, coming home cold and empty-handed on days I hadn't visited the pond at all, because a boy who never failed was a boy people started watching. Yuki noticed anyway. Of course she did. She was the one who'd handed me the ring in the first place, and something in her, some old intuition from a mother-in-law who'd told her it opens for the right person, meant she watched me with a particular kind of attention nobody else in the village bothered with. She didn't ask directly. She was too careful for that, or perhaps too afraid of the answer. Instead, she started finding reasons to walk with me toward the river of an evening, the way she had that first autumn, carrying water buckets that didn't need carrying, and one night, with the winter stars hard and bright overhead, she said quietly, not looking at me, "The ring got warm in my hand once. Years ago, just once. I thought I'd imagined it." I didn't answer right away. I was still learning that winter how much truth a person could survive being handed all at once. "It's not imagining," I said finally, "but I can't explain it to you standing here." "Not yet." She nodded, slowly, and didn't push, and something about the way she accepted that, no demand, no suspicion, just a quiet willingness to let the mystery sit until I was ready to open it properly, settled something in my chest that had been unsettled since the night I watched a different version of her disappear under black water. I would tell her everything, eventually. I would show her the pond, the warm soil, the fish that bred faster than any river fish should. But that would come later, once I understood my own gift well enough to explain it without sounding like a boy who'd lost his mind to hunger and grief. By midwinter, I had built something that felt less like a boy's lucky streak and more like the beginnings of an actual careful operation, though I never let myself use a word that grand out loud. I varied my routes. I varied my timing. I let Mitsuo's smokehouse absorb the bulk of what I brought out, since a paid consignment left the least visible trail, but I also began quietly leaving a portion, never much, never enough to draw a second glance, directly with families I knew were closest to the edge, framed always as a leftover catch I couldn't be bothered to carry the extra distance to sell. An old widower 2 houses down from Kiyo's, a family with 4 children, and a father laid up from a bad fall. Small gifts, spread thin, disguised as the ordinary generosity of a boy who would rather give away a fish than let it spoil. I kept a private, careful count in my head of who I'd helped and by how much, not out of pride, but out of the same instinct that had made me test the pond's limits in the first place. Some part of me wanted to understand the shape of the debt I was building, to whom, and what it might eventually cost to repay it, if repayment was ever even the right word for what this gift wanted from me. For now there were 2 carp on a cord, a fair-dealing smokehouse owner 2 villages over, and a widow walking beside me under cold stars, asking nothing, and somewhere behind an old tarnished ring, a pond that was slowly, patiently, in a way I was only beginning to understand, growing larger every time I chose to give more of its bounty away than I kept for myself. Chapter 3. The Healer's Secret Ingredient. The sickness came for the 3rd village in early winter, not the coughing fever that had taken my first family, but something meaner, a wasting kind of illness that started in the stomach and left grown men too weak to stand within a week. Famine sickness, the old folk called it, though everyone knew hunger alone didn't explain how fast it moved from house to house, or why it hit the weakest, the very old, the very young, hardest of all. That was how I met Satomi. She wasn't a physician in any formal sense. There was no formal sense to be had in 3 villages this poor, this far from any real town. She was simply the woman people went to when someone was dying and there was no one else to go to. a herbalist who'd learned her trade from a mother who'd learned it from a grandmother, in an unbroken line of women who kept the knowledge of which root stopped fever and which bark settled a stomach passed down because no one else had bothered to write any of it in a book. That inheritance came with a cost most people in the villages never bothered to think about. Satomi had buried her own mother 2 summers back. From a sickness, her mother's own remedies hadn't been strong enough to turn, and I would learn much later from small things she let slip on quieter evenings that she carried a particular, specific guilt about that, the guilt of a healer who had watched her own skill fail the one person she most needed it to save. I recognized that guilt the moment I properly understood its shape. It fit against my own like 2 halves of the same broken bowl. She was, by the time I met her, perhaps 5 years older than me in this new body, though ancient in the way that responsibility ages a person regardless of their actual years, the specific tiredness of someone who has never once been allowed to be the one who needs taken care of. I found her by accident, or by whatever the universe had decided to call fate in my particular case. Carrying a fresh catch to Mitsuo's smokehouse, I passed a hut with its door hanging open despite the cold, a bad sign in a famine winter, and heard a child crying in the specific, exhausted way of a child who has been crying for hours and has nearly run out of the strength for it. I should have kept walking. I told myself that later. Many times, I didn't keep walking. Inside, an old woman lay on a mat, too still, skin gone the gray color that even a boy who'd never trained as a healer in either of his lives could recognize as dangerous. And a younger woman, Satomi, though I didn't have her name yet, knelt over her, grinding something in a stone bowl with the particular controlled desperation of someone doing everything right and watching it not be enough. "She needs water that isn't going to make it worse," Satomi said, not even looking up at the stranger in her doorway. "Because in a famine winter, you take help from whoever's standing there and sort out who they are afterward. The well's gone bad. Everyone's well has gone bad. I need clean water, and I don't have it." I had clean water. I had water that had healed a 2-week blister in the space of one short walk along a warm black bank. I told her I knew a spring that hadn't turned, a small clean source most people didn't know about, and I'd bring her some. She barely acknowledged the offer beyond a short nod, too deep in her own fight to spare attention for a strange boy's claims, and I left and did not come back with an ordinary bucket of ordinary water. I came back with pond water, water I'd carried through a door that didn't exist, in a jug I made sure to dent and scuff so it wouldn't look too clean, too new, too impossible for a poor fisherman's boy to own. I want to be honest about the fear in that decision because it would have been easy to write it as simple heroism, and it wasn't. Every rule I'd made for myself said, take little, give little, never do anything a starving village couldn't plausibly explain with ordinary luck. Handing a dying woman water that might genuinely, visibly, undeniably save her when 3 other remedies hadn't, that was the opposite of small. That was the kind of thing people remembered, the kind of thing people built stories around. And stories in a hungry and frightened village had a way of curdling into accusations. I did it anyway. I stood in that doorway with a jug of glowing pond water, disguised as spring water, and thought with a clarity that had nothing to do with logic. I have already stood on one riverbank and let someone die because I was afraid of the cold. I'm not doing that again, not even a version of it, not ever. The old woman didn't wake that night, but she didn't worsen either, which in a sickness that had been taking people within the week was itself remarkable. And by the 3rd day, the gray had started leaving her skin, slow and stubborn, the way color returns to a bruise. Satomi noticed. Of course she noticed. She'd spent every waking hour of that week watching for exactly this kind of change, hunting for it the way a starving man hunts for food, and when it finally came, she turned to me with an expression I hadn't expected. Not gratitude, not yet, but a sharp assessing suspicion, very close to the one Mitsui had given me over 6 healthy fish. "That spring," she said. "Where is it exactly?" "Hard to find," I said, which was true in the most literal way possible. "I can bring you more. I can't easily take you there. The path's bad, and I don't want it trampled by half the village once word gets out." It was a thin excuse. I watched her decide, the same way Mitsui had decided, that a thin excuse attached to a genuine cure was not a thing worth pushing on too hard in the middle of a crisis that was actively killing people. She nodded, filed her suspicion away for later. I could see her doing it, tucking the question behind her eyes rather than releasing it. and turned back to her patient. And that was, in its own quiet way, the beginning of trust between us. I brought her water twice a week after that, always in scuffed jugs, always claiming the same hard-to-reach spring, and I watched her work the way I'd watched Mitsue weigh fish, carefully, professionally, looking for the trick even as she used the gift. She started mixing my water into her strongest tinctures rather than drinking it plain, which I understood instinctively was smarter than I'd have managed myself. Diluted and folded into bark and root, the pond's effect became harder to isolate, harder to notice, easier to attribute to her own considerable skill. Her reputation grew that winter in a way that made me nervous in exactly the way I'd feared it would. People started walking from the third village, then from mine, then, worse, from villages further out that I didn't even have names for yet, all of them chasing rumors of a healer whose remedies worked when nothing else did. Satomi herself grew uneasy about it, which told me she was smarter than most people in her position would have been. "I'm good," she said to me one evening, mixing a fresh batch by lamplight while I pretended my visit was purely social. "But I'm not this good. I know the difference between skill and luck, and this isn't luck, it's something else, and I don't think you're going to tell me what." "Not yet," I said, and it was the same answer I'd given Yuki under the stars, and Satomi accepted it with the same tired, pragmatic grace Yuki had, not because she wasn't curious, but because a famine winter didn't leave much room for turning away help on principle. I liked her for that. I liked all three of them by then for the same quiet, unglamorous virtue, the willingness to take a gift without demanding to understand it first, trusting that the truth would come when it was ready to. The old woman she'd been fighting to save that first night, her name, I eventually learned, was Oyoni, a widow twice over who had outlived 2 husbands and, until that winter, expected to outlive the famine too out of sheer stubbornness, recovered fully within 2 weeks, strong enough by the month's end to be back at her own hearth, complaining, with real vigor, about the poor quality of that year's firewood. It became, without either of us planning it, a kind of quiet touchstone between Satomi and me. Whenever the weight of the secret got heavy, whenever I wondered if any of this was worth the risk I kept taking, I would think of Oyoni complaining about firewood, alive and irritable and utterly herself, and the arithmetic would settle back in my favor. Satomi began finding small ways to repay a debt she didn't fully understand the shape of. She taught me, over those visits, which local roots were safe to chew for hunger pangs and which only looked edible, which bark settled a cough and which merely masked one dangerously. It wasn't magic, it was ordinary, hard-won knowledge, freely given, and I found myself treasuring it in a way that surprised me, not because I needed it with a pond full of healing water at my back, but because it was hers, offered without calculation, in a winter where almost everything else I touched came wrapped in secrecy and careful lies. "You ask a lot of questions for a fisherman's boy," she said to me once, only half joking, watching me repeat back a list of root names she'd only just taught me. "I like knowing things," I said, which was true in both of my lives, and she huffed something that was almost a laugh and kept teaching me anyway. It was Satomi, sharp-eyed and professionally suspicious in a way neither Yuki nor Mitsui quite matched, who first said the word that would define the rest of that winter for me. "You know," she said, not looking up from her grinding, in the same flat tone she'd have used to note that the weather was turning, "Jiro's been asking about you." Jiro. The village head, not mine, but the third village's, the one whose people were most directly saved by Satomi's suddenly miraculous cures, and therefore the man with the most direct reason to wonder where an ordinary fisherman's boy fit into a run of good fortune too large and too consistent to be coincidence. "Asking what?" I said, keeping my voice as flat as hers. "Where the fish are coming from, why nobody's starving in 3 villages that should by rights be burying half their children by now. He hasn't said your name to me directly." She glanced up, finally, and there was something almost like a warning in it, one careful person to another. "But he will. Men like Jiro always get to the name eventually. You should think about what you're going to tell him before he asks." "What is he like?" I asked her, "when he's decided someone's guilty of something?" Satomi set down her pestle and actually thought about the question properly before answering, which told me something about how seriously she was taking it. Patient, she said finally. That's the dangerous part. Jiro doesn't accuse people in the heat of the moment. I've seen men do that, shout an accusation, and regret it inside a week once tempers cool. He waits. He gathers small things one at a time until he has enough small things stick together that nobody in the room can argue with the shape they make, and only then does he say anything out loud. By the time Jiro names a person a witch, half the village has already quietly decided the same thing without noticing they were being led there. That's not reassuring. It wasn't meant to be, she said, and went back to her grinding. I'm telling you because I like you, and because whatever you're not telling me is clearly keeping people I care about alive. And I'd rather you had time to prepare than get caught flat-footed the way I nearly did with Oyoni's illness. Whatever your secret is, Keita, and I have theories, I want you to know that I'm not as slow as I let you believe. You should decide soon exactly how much of it you're willing to let Jiro see before he decides for you how much he's already seen. I thought about that whole walk home, under a sky gone hard and clear with the deep cold of midwinter, turning the ring over in my pocket the way I did when I needed my hands to have something to do while my mind worked. I didn't have an answer yet, but I understood, with the particular cold clarity of a man who has already died once from moving too slowly, that I was going to need one soon. Chapter 4. The Net Tightens. A month is a strange unit of time to survive on a stolen miracle. Long enough to grow comfortable. Not nearly long enough to grow careless, though I came close once, in a way that still makes my stomach drop to remember. The pond had grown by then. Not dramatically. I want to be honest about the pace of it, because half the appeal of this whole impossible gift was how slow and earned it felt, rather than handed to me all at once like a jackpot. But where there had been one long, curling stretch of water that first night, there was now a second inlet branching off it, warmer even than the rest, where the fish that gathered seemed subtly different, fatter, calmer, slower to startle, the way fish behave in water that's never known a hook. I didn't understand yet what governed that growth. I only understood, from careful observation over 4 hard-won weeks, that it seemed to track something like risk given freely. Every time I stretched myself further than was safe to help someone who needed it, the pond answered with a little more room, a little more warmth, a little more life. It answered Satomi's dying patient with a new spring at the pond's second inlet, water that ran even sweeter than the rest. It answered 6 fish becoming a dozen, with a school of carp large enough that I genuinely lost count trying to estimate it. Whatever intelligence, if that was even the right word, sat behind that fisheye stone, it seemed to reward generosity with capacity, which meant the entire logic of my survival had inverted itself from every instinct a poor, hungry, previously dead man might otherwise have followed. Hoard less. Give more. That's how you grow strong here. It was, I reflected more than once, a strange kind of leveling system to be handed, no numbers glowing in the air above my head, no notifications, no tidy list of stats. Just warm soil that spread a little further every time I chose someone else's survival over my own comfortable secrecy, and a fisheye stone that seemed to be, in its slow and patient way, keeping score. I started, that month, to notice smaller signs of growth too, ones I might have missed if I hadn't already trained myself to watch closely. The reeds at the pond's original bank, which had stayed a strange, defiant green all through the coldest weeks, began to show the faintest hint of new shoots pushing up beside the old growth, as if the space had decided winter no longer fully applied to it. The light beneath the water surface, that faint inner glow I'd noticed the very first night, seemed a shade brighter than it had been a month before. Not dramatically, nothing I could have proven to another person, but enough that I noticed the way you notice a room has been rearranged before you can say exactly which piece of furniture moved. I found myself some evenings simply standing at the edge of that second inlet, doing nothing but watching the fattened, calm fish drift in water that had never known a hook, and thinking about how strange it was that the safest, warmest, most abundant place in my entire world was one I could show to almost no one in it. That was its own kind of loneliness I was learning, not the loneliness of having nothing, which I'd already lived through once, but the loneliness of having more than you can ever safely admit to. The close call came from an unlikely direction. Not Jiro, not yet, but a rival. His name was Renta, an older fisherman from my own village who'd worked that stretch of river for 30 years and had watched, with the particular bitterness of a proud man losing ground as a 14-year-old orphan suddenly started bringing in catches that made his own thin, hard-won hauls look pathetic by comparison. He'd said nothing outright, that wasn't his way, but he'd started watching me, following on 2 occasions at a distance he probably thought was subtle. I understood Renta better than I think he would have liked if he'd known how closely I was reading him in return. He wasn't a cruel man, not really, no more than Chio was a cruel woman. He was a man who had built his entire sense of worth on being the best fisherman in a hard trade, in a hard place across 30 patient years, and into that carefully earned identity had dropped a boy who seemed to succeed without any of the decades of scarred hands and ruined knees that Renta had paid for his own competence. I would have resented me too in his position. That understanding didn't make his growing attention any less dangerous, but it did help me predict him, which in the end mattered a great deal more than sympathy would have. The first time I noticed him following, it was clumsy enough that I almost laughed. A large man in a bright red winter coat has very few good places to hide along an open riverbank, and I spotted him within minutes, crouched behind a woodpile a good deal too small to actually conceal him. I simply fished badly in full view for the better part of an hour until the cold drove him off first and told myself it had been a lucky, isolated bit of nosiness. The second time, I nearly opened the door with him close enough to see it happen. I'd gone to the usual bend in the river where I claimed my lucky current ran, timing my visit for dusk the way I always did, ring already warming in my pocket in anticipation, and some instinct, some leftover animal caution from 2 full lifetimes of learning to survive, made me glance back over my shoulder one extra time before I reached for the stone. Renta, crouched behind a stand of frozen reeds 40 paces back, doing a poor job of pretending he was checking his own nets. I didn't open the door. I stood at that ordinary fishless bend of ordinary river for the better part of an hour, doing a passable impression of a boy having bad luck, cold enough by the end of it that my teeth genuinely chattered, and went home with nothing to show for the evening except a story about the current running wrong that night. I understood, walking home in the dark with my heart still going too fast, exactly how close that had been. One door opening in front of the wrong set of eyes, and 30 years of poor unlucky orphan would collapse into something far more dangerous than mere jealousy. Something that could travel in a village this frightened and this hungry all the way to the word witchcraft before I could stop it. I told Yuki about it that same night, finally, properly, the way I'd been promising myself I would for weeks. Not the whole truth. Not yet. Not the ring. Not the pond. Not the door. But enough. Enough for her to understand that my luck wasn't luck, that it needed protecting, that someone had come close to seeing something they shouldn't. She listened the way she'd listened to everything that winter, quiet, careful, unhurried, and when I finished, she said only, "Then I'll walk the bend with you." 2 people talking loudly about nothing in particular are a much less interesting thing to watch than one boy standing alone by the water. It was such a simple, practical piece of help that it took me a moment to understand how much it meant that she'd absorbed my half-truth, my obvious fear, my obvious evasions, and responded not with more questions, but with cover. Real, useful, immediate cover. I didn't tell her I loved her for it. I don't think either of us was ready for that word yet in a life this new and this strange. But something shifted between us that night on the frozen riverbank, something that had less to do with a debt paid on a different night in a different world, and more to do with who she was choosing to be right now for me. After that, Yuki began walking with me most evenings, not as a disguise exactly, though it functioned as one, but because I understood slowly the way I understood most things that winter. She had simply decided that whatever danger I was walking into, she preferred to walk into it beside me rather than hear about it afterward. We developed, without ever discussing it directly, a whole private language of cover stories. Loud complaints about a cousin's upcoming wedding when we wanted to seem like 2 people absorbed in gossip. Comfortable silences broken by nothing more than the crunch of frost underfoot when we wanted to seem like 2 people who simply enjoyed each other's company too much to need conversation at all. It worked, mostly because it wasn't really a performance. That was the strange, quiet truth I kept discovering that winter. The cover story and the actual feeling underneath it had stopped being two separate things. I did enjoy her company too much to need conversation. I did feel steadier walking beside her than I had any right to feel, given everything I still wasn't telling her. Renta, watching from whatever distance he thought was safe, saw exactly what he was meant to see, a boy and a widow growing close along a riverbank, and never once suspected that the real secret was hiding in plain sight of that very ordinary, very true story. Yuroi finally said my name 3 weeks later, and it happened, appropriately enough, at Satomi's door. I was there delivering water, openly by then, since I'd become enough of a fixture at her hut that nobody thought twice about the fisherman's boy who brought her a jug twice a week. When Jiro arrived, with 2 of the village's older men flanking him, the specific formation of a man who wanted witnesses for whatever he was about to say. "Keita," he said, and I felt my whole body go carefully, deliberately still, the way you go still in front of an animal that hasn't decided yet whether to charge. You've been very lucky this winter. Fish where there shouldn't be fish, water that cures what should have killed half my village by now. I'd like to understand where that luck is coming from. I had thought for 3 weeks about what I would say when this exact moment arrived, and what I'd landed on wasn't a lie so much as it was a very careful arrangement of true things. I found a spring on land nobody else wanted, I said. Past the bad current most fishermen avoid. It's clean, and it's mine, because I'm the only fool willing to walk that far in winter to reach it. I've been bringing what I find to people who need it more than I do, because I remember what it is to have nothing, and I didn't want anyone else finding out what that felt like if I could help it. It was, I want to be clear, almost entirely true. I had found the spring through a door instead of a path, but found it nonetheless. I was bringing it to people who needed it. I did remember, with a clarity that spanned 2 entire lifetimes, exactly what it was to have nothing. Jiro studied me for a long moment, the way a man studies a fish he's caught to decide whether it's worth the trouble of cleaning, and I watched him weigh the plain, unglamorous decency of my answer against however many darker explanations his imagination had supplied him with beforehand. Jiro didn't answer right away. He glanced instead at Satomi, who kept her eyes fixed on her grinding bowl with a studied neutrality I recognized as its own kind of loyalty, and then at the 2 older men flanking him, as if checking whether my answer had satisfied them as much as it apparently grudgingly satisfied him. "You understand," he said, turning back to me, "why I have to ask. A village head who doesn't ask questions when good fortune arrives from nowhere is a village head who deserves whatever disaster follows it. I've buried people who trusted the wrong stroke of luck before. I don't intend to bury more on my watch because I was too polite to look a gift in the mouth." "I understand," I said, and I meant that too, more than he could have known. I had, after all, spent an entire previous lifetime learning exactly what happens when good people look away from hard questions at the wrong moment. Then understand this as well. He stepped half a pace closer, close enough that I caught the smell of wood smoke and cold on his coat, close enough that his voice dropped to something meant only for me, though I don't doubt Satomi heard every word of it too. Charity earns a village's gratitude. Charity that can't be explained earns its fear, and fear in a hungry village doesn't stay quiet for long. I don't think you're doing anything unnatural, boy. I've watched you too closely these last weeks to believe that anymore, whatever the first rumors said. But I need you to understand that what I believe and what a frightened, starving crowd decides to believe are 2 very different animals, and I can only hold the second one back for so long before it stops listening to reason entirely. "See that it stays that way," he said finally, straightening, his voice returning to its earlier public register for the benefit of his witnesses. "Charity, not sorcery. I'll be watching either way, boy. A village this hungry doesn't need one more reason to turn on its own. It wasn't trust. It wasn't even close to trust, but it was, for now, enough room to keep breathing in, and I understood, watching him leave with his 2 silent witnesses in tow, that I had just been granted a reprieve rather than a resolution. The net had tightened. It hadn't closed. Not yet. Satomi waited until the door had fully shut behind them before she spoke again, not looking up from her work. "That went better than I expected," she said. For whatever that's worth. You didn't say anything. I didn't need to. She glanced up at last, something dry and almost fond in her expression. I've already decided which side of this I'm standing on, Kyoto. I decided that the night Oyon's breathing evened out, and I couldn't explain why. I'm just waiting for you to trust me with the rest of the reasoning. I didn't answer that directly. But I understood, walking home under a sky finally starting to soften toward the first hint of spring, that the list of people I'd eventually have to trust with the truth was growing whether I'd planned for it to or not, and that every single name on it so far had earned its place there honestly. Chapter 5. A Season of Ghosts and Growth. Winter broke eventually, the way even the worst winters always do, though not before it demanded one more price from me, the highest one yet, and the one that finally forced me to understand exactly what this gift was going to cost. Going forward, if I meant to keep using it the way I'd chosen to use it. It happened in the last hard freeze of the season, the one old folk called the False Springs Warning, and it happened to Mitsu. I'd known, in the vague way you know things about people you like but haven't asked too many personal questions of, that she had a younger brother, sickly since birth, kept mostly out of sight in the rooms behind the smokehouse, the kind of quiet family shame that nobody discusses directly in a village this small and this poor. I'd caught glimpses of him over the months, a thin shape moving past a doorway, a small cough carrying through a wall, and I'd understood without ever being told directly that his existence was the real, unspoken reason behind every fair price Mitsuo ever gave, every debt she refused to carry, every ounce of careful, unsentimental practicality she'd built her whole adult life around. A girl who inherits a dying business and a sickly younger brother in the same season doesn't get the luxury of being anything other than relentlessly, protectively competent, and I had come, by that point in the winter, to respect her for it more than I'd let myself say out loud. I hadn't needed to meet him properly until the night Mitsu came pounding on my aunt's door well past dark. Her composure, the same sharp, unshakable composure that had made her the only fair-dealing smokehouse owner for 3 villages around Bike, completely gone. He's not breathing right, she said, and I understood from the particular register of her fear that this was the kind of not breathing right that ended in a small grave by morning, if nothing changed. I didn't have time for careful half-truths that night. I didn't have time to disguise a jug, to invent a plausible spring, to manage the story the way I'd managed every other story that winter. I ran with her to the smokehouse, and I found a boy of perhaps 8 years old, lips gone the same dangerous gray I'd seen once already that winter on Satomi's dying patient, breath coming in short, shallow, wrong little pulls that told me, with the flat certainty of 2 lifetimes of watching people die, that ordinary remedies were not going to be fast enough. I sent Mitsuo for Satomi, that much at least could look ordinary, a smokehouse owner fetching the local healer for a sick child, nothing anyone would ever question, and in the handful of minutes that bought me alone with the boy, I made the choice I'd been avoiding making cleanly all winter. I opened the door, right there, in a back room of an ordinary smokehouse, with no time to disguise anything, no time to scuff a jug or invent a spring, no time to manage a single piece of the story afterward. I carried the boy through myself. I want to be honest, even now, about how reckless that was, how completely it broke every rule I'd built to keep this gift secret, and laid him on the warm black soil at the pond's edge, in water that had cured a blister in an afternoon and a dying woman in a week, and I knelt there in that impossible glowing place with a child's uneven breathing under my hands and thought, with a strange, floating calm, if this doesn't work, I have just shown a hidden miracle to no one, for nothing, and lost him anyway. It worked. Not instantly. Nothing about this pond had ever worked instantly. I understood that much by now. But within minutes, his breathing eased, the gray began stubbornly to recede, and by the time I carried him back through the door into the ordinary smokehouse, no more than a quarter hour having passed on the other side, though it had felt like an entire held breath. Satomi and Mitsue were only just arriving and found a boy sleeping, exhausted but steady, in the arms of a fisherman's son who had, as far as either of them could tell, done nothing more remarkable than hold him and wait. I let them believe that. I let Satomi credit her own quick treatment once she arrived, folding a dose of my water into a tincture the way she always did, giving the whole recovery a shape that made sense to a village that could not be allowed to know the truth of it. Mitsu had seen my face in that first terrible minute, had seen the particular certainty in it. The certainty of a man who knows exactly where he is going and why. And I think some part of her understood, even without being told, that whatever had actually saved her brother that night had very little to do with luck. She didn't ask. Not that night, not for weeks afterward, but something in how she looked at me changed. Less like a business partner assessing a supplier, more like a woman who has decided on the strength of one desperate night to trust a mystery she isn't yet permitted to solve. Her brother's name, I learned in the days that followed, was Haru, and once the immediate danger had passed, he turned out to be a bright, curious child, utterly starved for company his own age, kept isolated for so long by his own frailty that he developed the particular over-eager friendliness of a boy unused to visitors. He took to me quickly, in the guileless way children do when an adult treats them like a person rather than a problem to be managed, and in the weeks after that terrible night, I found myself, more often than made any strategic sense, finding excuses to stop by the smokehouse and let him talk my ear off about whatever small fascination currently held him. A bird's nest he'd spotted through the window, a story one of the older boys had told him, a riddle he was certain I wouldn't be able to solve. Mitsue watched these visits with an expression I found difficult to name at first, and only later understood as something like grief mixed with gratitude. Grief for all the ordinary childhood her brother had been denied by his own weak lungs. Gratitude that anyone was finally giving him a version of it now. She never said thank you for that either, the same way she'd never said thank you for the fish that first winter, but she started setting aside, unprompted, small portions of whatever she had smoked that week whenever I came by, and I understood that particular silent language well enough by then to know exactly what it meant. Spring came properly after that. The real thaw, the kind that meant the worst of the famine, had finally broken its grip on 3 villages that had, against every reasonable expectation, come through the winter with fewer deaths than any of the surrounding regions. Jiro noted it publicly at the small shrine gathering held to mark the season's turn, crediting hard work and careful rationing, and grudgingly, without naming me directly, a run of good fortune that held longer than good fortune usually does. I stood at the back of that gathering, the way I'd once stood at the back of a very different gathering in a very different life, burning paper money for a woman I'd failed to save. This time I watched Yuki near the front, healthy and steady in a way she hadn't been that first autumn I'd started carrying her water buckets. I watched Satomi, her reputation now stretched thin across 4 villages and growing, careful and sharp-eyed as ever, but no longer looking at me with quite so much suspicion. I watched Mitsue standing a little apart with her brother, small, pale, but breathing easily, laughing at something one of the other children had said, and I felt for the first time since I'd opened my eyes as Keita in a hungry winter I'd been given no warning about, something that was almost like peace. Almost. Because peace, I was learning, was never a permanent state in a life like the one I'd been given. Only a pause between one quiet crisis and the next, and I'd lived long enough across 2 lifetimes now to know better than to mistake a pause for an ending. Renta was there too, at the edge of that gathering, and when our eyes met across the crowd, he gave me a short, grudging nod. Misawa, not friendship, not yet, but the particular respect one competitor eventually extends another once the competition has stopped feeling personal. I understood, without needing it explained, that some of his earlier hostility had softened over the winter into something more like resigned professional curiosity, the same way Mitsu's had, the same way Jiro's watchfulness had settled into something closer to wary tolerance. I hadn't won any of them over with grand gestures. I'd simply kept showing up, kept giving away more than I kept being, as plainly and consistently as I knew how, the kind of person a frightened village could eventually decide not to fear. That same evening, walking the long way home, along the riverbank out of habit more than need, I felt the ring warm against my chest in a way it never had before. Not the steady, familiar pulse that meant the door was ready to open, but something sharper, more urgent, like a question being asked for the first time. I stopped at the water's edge and drew the ring out, and in the dying spring light, for just a moment, I thought I saw something in that fisheye stone that wasn't simply light and color anymore. A shape, brief, indistinct, gone before I could be certain I hadn't imagined it, but unmistakably for that one heartbeat, the outline of a face that was not my own, watching me back from somewhere on the other side of the glow, patient, ancient, and I would have sworn it, standing there with the whole spring evening gone, suddenly very quiet around me, waiting. Whoever had owned this ring before Yuki's mother-in-law, before whatever unknowable chain of hands had carried it down to a drowned river and a second chance, had not simply left behind an object. They had left behind a question. And standing on that riverbank with an entire hard winter finally fully behind me, I understood with total certainty that the pond, the growing warmth of that hidden world, the strange scorekeeping generosity of it all, none of that was the whole story. I thought, standing there, of everything in the winter had actually cost and given in equal measure. A widow I had failed once and refused to fail twice, now walking beside me most evenings without needing a reason. A sharp-guarded healer who had started teaching me her mother's knowledge simply because I'd asked and kept asking. A smokehouse owner who trusted me with the one thing she protected more fiercely than her own business because I'd been the person standing there when it mattered. A village head who suspected me and watched me, and had not, in the end, found a single thing he could safely call witchcraft. A rival who'd gone quiet for now, having found nothing but a boy in love with a widow and unusually good at reading a bad current. None of it had come free. I understood that better than most people my apparent age had any right to. Every gift the pond had given me I'd paid for first, in risk, in fear, in the particular exhaustion of maintaining two entire lives at once, one visible and one hidden, and keeping the seams between them invisible to everyone who mattered. But I had done it. 3 villages had survived a famine that, in whatever other version of this world existed without a fisherman's boy and his impossible inheritance, might well have buried a third of their children before spring. That fact alone, I decided, standing on that quiet riverbank with the ring cooling slowly in my palm, was worth every sleepless night it had cost me. And still, that faint, impossible face in the stone stayed with me the whole walk home, patient, ancient, watching, waiting for something I hadn't yet worked out how to give it. Whatever this ring truly was, whoever had carried it before me through however many hands and however many drowned rivers, I understood with the same total certainty that had once sent me into black water to save a woman I'd already failed once, that the pond behind that fisheye stone was not the end of what I'd been given. It was only the first page. And I intended to read every single one that followed.